Good day, students, and welcome to another lecture on the history of India between 750 CE and 1206 CE. Today, we will be gaining an overview of the different forms of religion and culture at this time. The early medieval period saw a range of developments in India's religious sphere. India was extremely culturally diverse at this time, and the spectrum of religion ran from ancient Naga cults to Hindu practices to Buddhist and Jain religions, and even the advent of Islam. Texts, inscriptions, architecture, and sculpture all give us ways to understand religion at this time. The principal features of religious development at this time was the continuity of trends in operation from the early historical period. Thus, there was an increasing popularity of Hindu cults surrounding Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti. Worship focused on temples and pilgrimages. This was also the period where the visible influence of tantric traditions became evident on Hindu, Buddhist, and even Jain methods of worship. In contrast to the wide-ranging popularity of the Hindu cults, Buddhism and Jainism came to be more geographically restricted during this period. Thus, Jainism was mainly popular in Western India and Karnataka, while Buddhism was dominant in Eastern India and Kashmir. The ancient Naga cults like Nilamata Naga continued to exist in this period. This was also the time of interreligious interaction, absorption, and syncretism. In the Bhagavad Puran, the Jain Tirthankar Rishabh was claimed as an avatar of Vishnu. Several other Purans and the famous text Geet Govind by Jayadev claim Buddha to be the ninth incarnation of Vishnu. Buddhism was also present in Hindu temple architecture, as for example in the Brihadishwar temple at Tanjore, where a seated Buddha is depicted on the right of the temple gateway, and Buddha under the Bodhi tree is present in carvings all around the temple. Of course, all interreligious interactions were not harmonious. For example, the Jainas and the Shaivas shared mutual hostility in South India. Such sentiments were often expressed in sculpture, where deities might be trampling their rivals. But generally speaking, most interactions were quite peaceful. This is often demonstrated by the shared use of shrine spaces. The best example of this is at Ellora in Aurangabad of Maharashtra. The 6th century CE saw the simultaneous creation of Buddhist and Hindu shrines at the southern and northern end of the caves. One of the most remarkable shrines at Ellora is the Kailashnath temple, constructed between the 8th and 9th century CE. Another similar site was at Badami in the Bagalkot district of Karnataka, where Shaiva, Jaina, and Vaishnava shrines were built in adjacent caves. Shrines in general gained in importance in the early medieval period, often gaining royal patronage. From the 10th century onwards, we see the rise of royal temples, which were important parts of religious, cultural, and commercial life. The growth of the cults also helped define regional cultures and the framing of identities like Hindu identity. We will now take a brief look at the developments of the various religions. At this time, Buddhism was mainly centered in its monasteries. The famous Chinese monk, traveler, and scholar Xuanzang, also known as Huan-Sang, has left us detailed discussion and descriptions about the Buddhist monasteries of India at this time. He describes Nalanda, Tilodaka, and Bodh Gaya, among many others. He possessed some special knowledge of Nalanda as he studied Yogachar there for 5 years. From his writings, we can form an image of the Buddhist monasteries. These structures were well built, with each corner anchored by a 3-storied tower. Doors, windows, and walls were liberally painted and decorated. Inside the monastery, the middle of the building was occupied by large assembly halls and was surrounded by chambers. All doors faced eastwards. The monks lived in individual cells, which were plain on the outside but quite well decorated on the inside. Many Buddhist monasteries continued to flourish till the 13th century, such as Shanchi or Amaravati. Texts like the Chachnama referred to Buddhism growing in Sindh. Kashmir, which had long been a center of Buddhism, had monasteries like Ratnagupta and Ratnaroshi in the 11th and 12th centuries. Even the older ones, like the Srinagar and Raj monasteries, had declined by then. Buddhism also flourished in eastern India, in Bengal and Bihar under Pala rule. Nalanda, Odantapura, Bikramshila, and Shomapuri were some of the more prominent monasteries that had grown up there. These centers saw active and ongoing exchange of ideas with Tibetan monks. Odisha also had Buddhist centers, as can be determined by the discovery of stupas, monasteries, and sculptures at Lolitgiri and Ratnagiri. Nepal was another center, with Buddhist bihars being constructed in Ladakh, Lahul, and Spiti. It should be noted that Tantric thought had a lot of influence on the nature of Buddhism being practiced at these monastic centers. Mahayana forms of worship did prevail in some areas. The Bodhicharyavatara of Shantidev, which dates back to the 8th century CE, has discussed this in detail. Some rituals that were followed were bathing the image with scented water, preparing offerings of food, flowers, and clothes, swinging censers, burning incense, and all of this was to be accompanied by the performance of music, both vocal and instrumental. Inscriptions bear out these details. For example, the Maitrakas of Vallabhi made donations to pay for incense, lamps, oil, flowers, and memorialized this in donative inscriptions. However, it was the Tantric form of Buddhism that would come to be predominant, also known as Vajrayana Buddhism, which literally translates to thunderbolt or diamond vehicle. This form of worship combined ritual with magic and meditation. The important texts of Vajrayana were Manjusri Mukalpa and the Gujja Samaj, which dated back to the 5th and 6th centuries CE. Another name for Tantric Buddhism was Mantrayana, and mantras were considered as a vital part of spiritual practice. Now, Buddhism did considerably decline in this period. It became limited geographically as well as politically and culturally. Historians have discussed various reasons for this. The revival of a more aggressive Hinduism, led by thinkers like Shankar, the failure of Buddhism to maintain its own distinct identity in this situation, increasing tantric influence causing decline in doctrine, and also the Turkish invasions that led to the destruction of various major monastic centers. However, it should be noted that this is still an ongoing area of study, and many monastic centers in Tibet and the Himalayan region not only survived but continued to function till the present day. Moving on to Jainism. Jainism also had its areas of predominance, such as Rajasthan, Gujarat, Bengal, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and Karnataka. At this time, the Digambar sect was more widespread than the Shwetambar sect. There was a range of royal patronage for the religion as well, like the Chapa and the Paramara kings of Gujarat, the Gangas, Rashtrakutas, Chalukyas, and Kadambas of the Deccan, all of whom were eager to patronize Jain scholars and Jain establishments. Jainism at this time enjoyed considerable linguistic diversity in its texts, and we see the use of Sanskrit, Prakrit, Kannada, Tamil, and Apabhrangsha by Jaina scholars like Akalanka, Haribhadra, and Vidyananda. Akalanka and Haribhadra were logicians from the 8th century. Vidyananda was a 9th century philosopher from Pataliputra. Additionally, there were scholars like Jinoshen and Gunabhadra. Their Adi Puran, which outlined various sanskaras for the Jainas, shows the ascent of Brahmanical influence, as it outlined how Shudras were to be excluded from religious rituals and barred from monkhood. Jaina shrines were scattered all over the country. In the east, they could be found in Shamatata and Pundravardhana of Bengal, in Udayagiri and Khandagiri of Orissa. In North India, they were found in Deoghar and Mathura. Now, to the west in Rajasthan was located the spectacular Dilwara temple. Gujarat had temples in Girnar and Vallabhi, including the famous Chandraprabha temple and one temple dedicated to Mahabir. In central India, Jaina shrines were found at Shonagiri and Khajuraho. In Maharashtra, Jaina temples were found at Nashik, Pratishthan, and even at Ellora. Jainism was particularly important in Karnataka, and Shravan Belgola was a famous center. Other temples were located in Koppana. Pallav, Chola, and Panda kings patronized Jainism in southern India, and this is attested to by donative inscriptions found in the temples located there. From Jainism, we now come to Hinduism. Hinduism did not present a single picture at this time. Rather, it was a collection of philosophies, movements, and cults. Thus, it is better to look at these individually. Shankar and Advaita Vedanta. Shankar was one of the most influential philosophers of the early medieval period. But it is difficult to write a clear historical account of him due to the various legends that have been created around his person through multiple hagiographies composed after the 14th century. According to the Shankar Digvijay of Madhav, he travelled across the country, debated with various scholars, and defeated all of them. Shankar principally propagated his views about the Vedanta texts. Now, the scholar Gaudapada had discussed the Advaita or non-dualistic Vedanta in the 7th to 8th century text Mandukya Karika, which was a commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad. This was the philosophy that was further developed by Shankar. His principal objective was demonstrating that the Brahma Sutras and Upanishads formed a single unified philosophy. His argument was that while Vedic sacrifices and rituals were appropriate for people desiring worldly gain, the Upanishads were the true path to gain supreme knowledge of the ultimate reality of Brahman and how the Atta or soul is one with it. According to him, this realization is the key to getting freedom from the cycle of birth. It has been argued by historians that Shankar's vigorous propagation of Vedanta was an important factor in the decline of Buddhism. It should also be noted that there are some key similarities between his ideas and that of Mahayana Buddhism, such as seeing everyday reality as illusion. This is why many criticized him as being a Buddhist in disguise. Shankar, however, strongly defended his position and produced critiques of Buddhism as well as of other schools of philosophy like Shankho, Nyaya, and Mimamsa. While it has been said that he founded the Dashanami sect as well as several monasteries or motts, there is still some debate. While some form of organization did definitely exist, a lot of these mathas, including those at Sringeri and Kachi, were established much later, as late as the 14th century, and Shankar's name was connected to them later for the sake of prestige. Now we come to Vishnuism and Shaivism. In the early medieval period, the idea of Vishnu having 10 avatars came to be widely accepted, while the worship of Krishna also became a major focus. Texts like the Harivansha and the 10th century South Indian text Bhagavad Puran, which contained the Krishna Charit, described the birth of Krishna and important events from his life. In these texts, bhakti as a form of worship and the relation between devotee and God was mentioned. It is notable that none of these texts mention Radha. It would be Jayadev's famous Geet Govind of the 12th century that made Radha famous and established a love between Radha and Krishna as a major theme. Apart from Krishna, the other avatars of Vishnu were also depicted in sculpture in various temples. The goddesses Lokhi, Saraswati, and Bhudevi were associated with Vishnu. Shiva worship was also becoming more popular at this time and was accompanied by the development of various schools of philosophy. Thus, the Agama texts were followed by the Shaiva Siddhanta, Kashmir Shaivism, and the Veer Shaiva groups. These texts were considered to be authoritative and they gave a lot of importance to Shaiva Bhakti. While they recognized the Vedic tradition, they felt it should be interpreted through Shaiva Bhakti. The Kashmir Shaiva school was non dualistic and argued that the soul or Atma was identical with Shiva. The universe itself was the manifestation of Shiva, and Shakti was the feminine aspect of the god. These ideas were contained in the Shiva Sutra texts, which had traditionally been revealed to sage Vashagupta by Shiva and dated to the 8th and 9th centuries CE. Mentions of the Devi are found in the Markandeya Puran of the 7th century and after that in many other texts. The Narayani Stuti mentions that Vaishnavi Shakti sustains the universe and her many forms Lokhi, Saraswati, Narayani, Kattayani, Durga, Bhadrakali, and Ambika all exist. Of these various forms, Durga was extremely popular and has been depicted in sculpture and architecture all over India. The various forms of the Devi called Matrikas are also mentioned and worshipped, as well as 64 Yoginis. Durga in multi-armed form has been depicted in many temples, especially in eastern India as well as in South India, where she is sometimes shown with a stag and sometimes also depicted as Nishumbha Mordini or the vanquisher of the demon Nishumbha. This type of Devi worship was very localized. Thus, in Orissa, there were Viraj and Stambeshwari. In Assam, there was Kamakha. These local traditions were woven together into one large cult of goddess worship by the Puranas. For example, as shown by historian Kunal Chakraborty, in Bengal, the meeting of Brahmanism and local goddesses resulted in cultural synthesis and the predominance of goddess worship. These multiple local traditions are reflected in the many names of the Devi, like the 108 names found in the Matsya Puran or the 1000 names included in the Kurma Puran. The Kalika Puran was also a very important text of Shakti worship. It made clear that the goddess had a calm form and a terrifying, enraged form. Each form had its own modes and places of worship, which were again detailed in the Puran. There was a definite trace of tantric influence in these rituals and ceremonies. The festival of Durga Puja, which in the present day is an immensely popular festival, was also discussed in this Puran. Various texts related to Shakti worship also mention pithas or sacred places where the worship of the goddess is carried out. The Kalika Puran mentions 7, the Kularnava Tantra mentions 18, and the Kubjika Tantra mentions 42 pithas. These pithas were sites of both worship and pilgrimage. According to historians, the increase in the number of pithas indicates the expansion of influence of this cult. We must also look at the patterns of bhakti worship in South India, specifically the Alvar and Nayanmar saints. While the roots of South Indian bhakti can be traced to certain elements of Sangam poetry in Tamil Nadu, it was the Alvar and Nayanmar saints that gave Shaivite and Vaishnava worship a distinctly South Indian character that was steeped in Tamil language and culture. Going by tradition, there were 12 Alvars and 63 Nayanmars. These saints themselves are worshipped in temples, and this practice is thought to have started in the Chola period. Their pictures and images were found in many temples, like the Vishnu temples. And while it is almost impossible to distill history from myth regarding the lives of the individual saints, the hymns still formed a core part of temple worship. Nayanmar was more of a title than a name. The saints referred to themselves as servants of Shiva. Of the 63, 3 saints, Sambandar, Appar, and Sundarar, are considered to be the most important. The idea of a group of Shaivite saints originated in the 8th century in a poem entitled Tiruttondar Tiruvantai, which listed 62 Nayanmars. The biographies of these saints and their songs were collected by Nambi Andar Nambi in the 12th century, and by the mid 12th century, they had been compiled in a text called the Periya Puranam. According to Upinder Singh, Alvar means those who dive deep or those who are absorbed in the divine. In the 10th century, Natha Muni collected the hymns of these 12 Alvar saints in the Nalayara Divya Prabandham, which also constituted the Vaishnava canon. The Alvar saints were also memorialized in a hagiography called the Divya Sucharitam in the 12th century. These bhakti saints came from diverse backgrounds. Some were Brahman, while others were kings, chiefs, officials, merchants, and some came from humble professions like cowherds, washermen, weavers, potters, etc. 2 saints are even referred to as untouchables, and they were associated with animal slaughter and leather work. Women, however, were underrepresented in the bhakti tradition. There were only 3 women among the Nayanmars and 1 among the Alvars. The mathas of these traditions did not admit women, and only after the 11th century were women devotees allowed greater participation in Shaiva bhakti tradition. In this context, historian Uma Chakraborty has pointed out that women were often marginalized in religious tradition. While male householders could and did participate in devotion, young women who were in families were excluded as their family commitments were seen as barriers to devotion. Even women's claims to asceticism and priesthood were discriminated against, as historian Ramaswamy has argued. And women who renounced their families were not seen as virtuous ascetics, but rather as rebels. Coming to a conclusion, it can be seen that the early medieval period was a time of great religious diversity, evolution, and change. While Buddhism was on the decline and even Jainism was getting restricted to certain parts of India, the various devotional cults within Hinduism were developing, diversifying, and growing in popularity. Bhakti was already on the rise and would continue its dominance in religious traditions for many centuries. Meanwhile, spiritual developments like the rise of Advaita Vedanta would have far-reaching impact for Indian philosophy.